Hello everybody, my name is Caitlin and welcome back to my channel where we discuss all things horror, and today we are going to be talking about Men. I saw this film yesterday afternoon and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since I've seen it, and I've been dying to talk about it with everyone and to see what people's thoughts were. It's definitely one of those films that's open to multiple interpretations, so I'm very curious to see how other people are interpreting the symbolism and just the overall themes of the film. So the very basic plot of Men is about this woman named Harper. She has rented out this beautiful house in the countryside, away from the city, away from everyone close to her, and she's going there as a retreat. She had a very traumatic incident with her husband. If you've seen in the trailers, there's hints that he killed himself, and she is going off to the countryside to heal herself, to get over the grief that she's been feeling over the loss of her husband. And while she's there, very bizarre things start to happen. She's really one of the only women in this small town. The town is pretty much made up of just men, as the title insinuates. And they're all very creepy men too. They just kind of hover around, they stare at her, and the more that she stays in this town, the more weird stuff starts to happen with these men. So that's the very basic plot of the film, but there is so much more happening under this surface level. It's going to be really hard to talk about this film without getting into the third act specifically. So I'm going to say off the bat here, this is going to be a review with spoilers. I'm going to give my general thoughts at the beginning here, and then towards the end I'll get into spoilers. So if you haven't seen the film, just keep that in mind. Again, I'll give you a warning before I start talking about spoilers. So I wasn't really sure how to feel about this film going into it. The trailers and a lot of the press material for the film made this seem like this was going to be a, you know, quote unquote Me Too type horror film. And I'm completely fine with the horror genre exploring issues like Me Too and misogyny. However, I feel like there's been this trend since the Me Too movement of not just horror films, but films and TV in general trying to tackle these themes, and I just find a lot of times they don't do it well. A lot of times it feels like they're just hitting you over the head with like, look at this message that we're trying to send to you, and it's like, yeah, I get it, I know what you're trying to say, but what about character development? What about good storytelling? So there was that element going into it, but then at the same time, I'm a huge fan of Alex Garland, the writer-director of this film. I'll be honest, I haven't seen Annihilation. I've seen bits and pieces of it here and there, but I love Ex Machina. Ex Machina is one of my favorite films of all time. So knowing that Alex Garland was going to be the one tackling this subject matter, I was pretty curious to see what he was going to do with it. And I have to say, overall, you know, I'm still figuring out how I feel about this film, and after I got out of it yesterday, I kept just being like, did I like that movie? Did I not? Overall, I'm going to say I really enjoyed this film. The more I think about it and the more that I talk about it with other people, the more I'm like, yeah, I dug the hell out of this movie. This is definitely not a film for everyone. It is a slow burn horror film. It does take a while to get going. There's a lot of times where the film will just stop to show you like pretty images of nature, like close up of leaves blowing in the wind. And while I do think there's a purpose for those images, at times they can seem a little art house, like pretentious. So if you're not into that, you might find some aspects of this film a little annoying. And there's also a lot of symbolism happening. He throws a lot of symbolism at you at this. I'm sure if you've seen the trailer, you know immediately there's a lot of Adam and Eve type symbolism. But as the story goes on, there's also a lot of pagan symbolism and references to pagan gods and goddesses. There's also a lot of symbolism around gender, around fertility, sexuality, and death, of course. So he's throwing a lot at you. The entire time I was in the theater watching this, my mind was racing because I was just like, what does all this mean? And it's one of those films where there is not a clear answer what all of this means. It does not wrap up nicely. The one film that Men reminded me of is Mother. the Darren Aronofsky film that came out, I believe, in 2017. Right, that was a film that also used a lot of religious symbolism and was a film that you could read many different ways. There was a lot of different themes and ideas being explored. So if you're not into those type of films, if you want to have your films that wrap up nicely, you're probably not gonna like Men, because it is very open-ended and it is throwing a lot out of you, and you as the audience kind of have to figure out, like, okay, what symbolism is important here and maybe what's not. Because I feel like one thing that Alex Garland is doing here is throwing a lot of red herrings at you as well with the symbolism. There's a lot of symbolism that on the surface level feels very obvious, like the Adam and Eve type stuff. But I feel like he's doing that on purpose. I feel like he's trying to give you all of these iconography and ideas that you as the audience coming into it are very familiar with, and almost to lull you into like this false sense of security. Like you're kind of watching it right at the very beginning. You see Harper, she arrives at the house, and immediately the first thing that she does is go to the apple tree in the garden and pick the apple and bite it. Obviously embodying Eve in that moment, right? It's almost like he's saying, like, yeah, here audience, here's your very obvious Adam and Eve symbolism. You think this is going to be an Adam and Eve story, and then out of nowhere it's like, well, here's this pagan god. Try to figure that out. What does that mean in relation to the story? So some of you will probably love this movie because it is so open-ended, and some of you may hate this movie because it's so open-ended. It's just one of those films. I will say though, there is some great special effects in this film, especially in the third act, which is just completely bonkers. And the film has a lot of really good suspense as well. As a woman watching this film, there were definitely moments where I felt like he captured just the uneasiness that sometimes as a woman you can feel being in a setting where you only have men around you and they're all just kind of staring at you. I don't want to give too much away here, but there is one moment where she's in the house that she's rented out, and there is a character that appears and starts looking in the windows of the house, and she doesn't notice him at first, and it's just this very dreadful scene of her kind of walking around the house. She's distracted with work, and you just see this character following her from the outside and just peeking in the windows and looking at her, and it feels so unsettling. And I really appreciated that he was able to capture this uneasiness without having to make it like overtly sexual. So I appreciated that he was able to create these very uneasy scenes, these scenes of suspense in a way that actually felt true to real life and wasn't, you know, completely over the top. So my general thoughts are, I really dug this movie. I enjoyed it a lot. Again, it is not a movie for everybody, but if you're into these type of movies, definitely check this film out. It'll be worth your time. All right, so from here to the rest of the video, I'm going to be talking about spoilers. So if you have not seen the film and you want to see the film, stop here, go watch the film, come back, and yeah, let's unpack this a little bit. So I'm still mulling over this film and everything that it showed. I don't have a clear answer either way as to what this film is really about. I don't know if there is a clear answer. I think there's multiple answers that you could give. And again, I feel like I see all of the threads that Alex Garland is giving us as the audience. Like, yes, I see the Adam and Eve symbolism. I see the Christianity symbolism. I see the paganism. I see the themes of grief and loss. There's the theme of guilt throughout the film that's very strong as well. There's themes related to fertility. There's themes of rebirth. And of course, there's the themes of misogyny and how women are treated in society. And also the exploration of the very unique experience of being a woman and going through grief and feeling guilt, right? So there's all these like threads that I feel like I see them very clearly. I'm just not quite sure how to tie them all together. So if you've seen the film, you know, in the third act, there's this very bizarre sequence where all of the men that Harper has encountered throughout the film come back at the end, and it's discovered that it's really the same man that's been stalking her throughout the film, and even the same actor played all of these different characters. And at one point he shows up and he's naked and he has like leaves all over his face. It feels like he's very much trying to be a symbolic representation of the Green Man, which is a pagan god. So he shows up and is pregnant, I think. He definitely gives birth at one point and kind of gives birth to himself, essentially. And there's this very strange, very grotesque sequence of him being born, he gets pregnant, and then once again gives birth to himself. The theme of rebirth is very strong throughout this entire film. And so I read all of these different men as manifestations of Harper's guilt that she has over her husband's death. And the film establishes that Harper did not have a great marriage with her husband. She was the one that wanted divorce. She initiated the divorce, and he threatened to kill himself if she left him. You know, he went on a whole thing of like, we made a promise to God, like, how could you leave me? And all of this leads to a very violent encounter where he hits her and then she throws him out. And then that leads him to kill himself, although the film kind of even makes that ambiguous, because at one point Harper says like, oh, he went up to the apartment above mine and broke in and was trying to climb down from their balcony to my balcony and he slipped and fell. So there's even a question of like, did he really mean to kill himself or was it just an accident? But either way, Harper feels guilt, and there's the scene where she goes out and sees his dead body and he is laying on like one of those like metal fencing things, right? And the metal has pierced through his body. And so the injuries that he sustained in that fall are very similar to the injuries that the men at the end of the film in the third act have. So I read the men at the end of the film to be Harper's manifestation of her guilt and her grief. And not just guilt over the fact that her husband died, but also guilt over the fact that she has this newfound freedom that she wanted. So throughout the film, she's struggling with these emotions, right? The grief of losing someone close to her, but then also the relief of finally being free from that person and being able to embrace the life that she wants to. There's a very long sequence in the beginning of the film where we see Harper and she's just out in the woods and she's enjoying like the nature, and it's very beautiful. And that scene is very important because it's one of the few times that we see Harper actually embracing this freedom that she has. And of course, her embracing this freedom is immediately interrupted by the beginning of all this weird stuff happening and all these weird men starting to show up in her life. So again, the film is constantly pitting these two emotions of relief and grief against each other. And all of it manifests into this crazy third act. And there's definitely a sense throughout the film that she has to go through all of this. She has to beat these inner demons in order to fully be able to move on with her life, right? Again, being reborn. Rebirth is a huge theme throughout this film. You can even connect the theme to the symbolism of the Green Man. I might get this a bit wrong, but my understanding of the Green Man myth is essentially it is a pagan myth, and it has to do with the god being the Green Man, and he meets up with the goddess, right? They get together, they copulate, and she becomes pregnant. And of course, all this is symbolism for the creation of the world, as well as all of the seasons, the cyclical patterns that we see throughout the year. So the goddess is pregnant, and then by winter time, the Green Man dies, right? The god dies. Of course, being symbolism related to things dying off in the winter. And then the goddess gives birth to a new Green Man in the spring, because that's when things start blooming again. And the child grows up to be the new Green Man, the god reborn, and he copulates with the goddess, and the cycle begins again. So it's a bit of an odd myth, but you can definitely see the theme of rebirth within it. And I did think it was interesting that Alex Garland had the Green Man be the one that was pregnant and giving the birth. There's a lot of playing with gender norms in this film, right? I mean, again, having a whole sequence where you see men being pregnant and giving birth is not something that we usually see in film. And perhaps you could even connect that to a lot of the psychoanalytic theory that gets thrown around when talking about horror films specifically, right? There's this whole idea in horror films that when a woman has control of the knife or the weapon, that she's in charge of the phallus. Anyone that has the weapon at any point in time is the one that has the power because they're holding on to the quote-unquote phallic object. And Alex Garland is playing with that in this film as well. There are a few shots where we see Harper and she's holding a knife. These aren't subtle shots either. I mean, it's like shots from her waist with her holding the knife and the knife like jutting out from her waist. Like, it's pretty obvious what the symbolism is supposed to be there. Even before the Green Man gives birth, there's the scene where Harper's inside the house and he's outside and he's trying to get in and he's sticking his hand through the mail slot of the door. And then at one point she just takes the knife and like drives it through his arm. And so then he has like this injury that he sustains for the rest of the film. And there is this idea in psychoanalytic theory that, you know, when the woman, when she has the weapon and she uses it against the villain character, the man character, that she's symbolically castrating him. So maybe that's what was happening in this scene, and by castrating him, she got rid of his man powers, and that's what prompted him to start giving birth to himself. That's a bunch of psychological mumbo jumbo, so I'm gonna stop there. But I just bring it up as a way to show that there's really a lot of ways that you could be reading into this film, depending on where you're coming from, what your background is, the stories that you've read before, your relation to religion, your relation to psychology, theory, all of this stuff. I will just say, the imagery of Harper hurting the men physically, you could also relate it to her guilt that she's feeling and just the guilt that the other characters are trying to put on her for what happened to her husband. There's some talk throughout the film where you'll have one of the men characters telling Harper like, oh, well, you prompted him to kill himself. You weren't kind enough to him. You didn't forgive him. So again, also playing with this idea that, you know, like the woman is supposed to be like the all-loving wife all the time to her husband, and if she hurts him, then she's the monster in this scenario. It doesn't matter what he has done to her in the past, like she's not supposed to be the one hurting him. And so I think we see Harper, even though she doesn't want to take on that guilt and she very much wants to reject it, and she very clearly states in the film, like, no, I was not the one that caused him to jump. I think there is something in her psyche where it's like all of these societal expectations and pressures that are put on women and wives, like all of that is in the back of her head, and it's something that she is struggling with. Like on the outside, she wants to be like, no, it wasn't my fault, but there does seem to be something internally where she's like, well, maybe it was my fault. And again, I think that's why we see the manifestation of her guilt being all of these weird, creepy male figures. All these guys are very much symbols of the different facets of the patriarchy. You've got the obvious creepy men, you've got the men that seem nice but aren't, you've got the priest character that seems like he should be someone that you can trust, but he's also super perverted. And that's a theme that Alex Garland has played with before in at least Ex Machina. I can't speak to Annihilation because, again, I haven't seen it. But in Ex Machina, right, one of the things I love about that film is that you see this kind of duality of these two male characters. You have the Oscar Isaac character who's obviously very brutish and very overbearing, and then you have the guy that's supposed to be the nice guy and supposed to be helping the female android. By the end of the film, you get the sense like, no, he wasn't really the nice guy. Like, he also wanted to take possession of this female robot for his own pleasure. And so this is something that Alex Garland has explored in both of these films now, this idea of these different facets of men and the different ways that they can be very overbearing to women. And you even get some of that with the religious critique in the film. He's making reference to these different creation stories, whether it's Adam and Eve or the Green Man myth. But these religious stories are also very based in these binary ideas of this is the man's role and this is the woman's role. And it's always the woman's role of giving birth and being pregnant and pleasing the man. So it seems like he is asking us as the audience to really look at these stories that we've had throughout history, to look at this symbolism that is very popular within the collective consciousness or unconsciousness or both. The meanings that we give to an image of a woman biting an apple because of these stories that we have, and how these stories and symbols in many ways are also keeping down not just women but also men, how they're also perpetuating these certain gender roles or certain ideas that we have about women and men in society. And it's also these overlooming ideas that causes Harper to have all of these feelings of guilt and grief and questioning herself. Or maybe the film really is just about Alex Garland's love for Attack on Titan. I have no idea if anything that I've said in this video makes sense. Again, these are all just the ideas that came to me while I was watching this film. So again, I really liked this film. I've had a lot of fun thinking about it. And it was funny, after the film was over in the theater, as I was leaving, I got stopped by a couple of the other audience members that had seen the film, and they were asking me what I thought about it. And we were all discussing, like, was it in her mind? Was it not? And then at one point, the theater employees also came in. And usually there's like maybe 1 or 2 people for the cleaning crew at the end. But this was like 3 people that came in and were asking us, like, hey, what did you think about that? And we were just chatting about our thoughts and feelings of the film, which is an experience that outside of film festivals I haven't had. I haven't really had that at just a normal mainstream theater. So the fact that this film was able to strike up a conversation with all of us at the end, I think was pretty cool. So those are my very all over the place thoughts on Men. Have you seen this film? If you did, what did you think about it? What are your interpretations of the film? Let me know in the comments below, and I will talk to you next time. Thank you so much for watching.